the BLM's largest programs manages oil and natural gas extraction nationwide. This program brings in billions of dollars to the U.S. Treasury from productive wells. But what happens if the wells are no longer productive? I'm Azure Hall, and this is On the Ground, a Bureau of Land Management podcast. Most of the time, the BLM works with companies who have leased lands for oil and gas extraction to close the wells when they are no longer producing. But some of the wells have been out of production so long, they are considered orphaned. This week, I'm talking with Bill Beck, the Fluid Minerals Operations Branch Chief at the BLM's Wyoming State Office in Cheyenne. And Bill, what exactly is an orphaned well?
So an orphan well it's actually a great question to lead off with because it's one that there's not a lot of clarity when you listen to the news and literature. An orphan well, by definition, and this was actually defined in the bipartisan infrastructure law, what it basically says is that if there is no viable entity that can go and plug and reclaim the land around an orphan well or an abandoned well, then that, by definition, is an orphaned well. It's a well that has no anyone that can take care of it.
And where does the BLM's responsibility come in when it comes to orphan wells?
Well, it gets a little more complicated then. Orphan wells, they actually start out as idled wells. So we keep track of idled wells, how long they've been idled. We work with operators to try and get idle wells either onto production or plugged without becoming orphaned. And the idea is really for the operators or anybody who's ever had, who currently has, or who has ever had interest in that lease, to plug those wells in a timely and in a fashion, and so that we don't have to go back and plug them using taxpayer dollars or legislated appropriated dollars. Sometimes those operators are not viable. If the operators aren't viable, then we look at the folks who currently have interest in the lease. If they're available or not, then we look for folks that have ever had interest in that lease. Pursue them, notify them, make sure they're aware that, hey, you have a liability here. And it's been really cool to do that work. There's a lot of great stories that come around that. You see people who've maybe left the industry and they've worked together with other folks who had interest in lease, and they come together and figure out how to get that well plugged. And that's been very, it's encouraging to see that. We've also had some very large operators who, through their mergers and acquisitions, have acquired liability. Probably something not the way they looked at it, I'm sure. But if they're looking at it and how do we solve this problem, in a more strategic view? We'd rather not deal with it on a well-to-well basis. We'd rather look at the entire state and how can we come in there. And then these large operators have made their own teams dedicated to getting the orphan well, their idled well problems resolved.
So our first step is to reach out to the involved parties, give them an opportunity to plug it. And if that doesn't come to fruition, what does the BLM do next? Yeah,
so that's the point where we flag it as an orphan well, and then we have to look for funding. And so it's probably good right now to kind of put the numbers together. We hear these large numbers, millions of wells or millions of orphan wells. Those are actually probably more like idle wells that haven't had the determination whether they've had a viable entity or not. For example, in Wyoming, we could hear, on the order of thousands of wells that are orphaned. Actually, we've not really had more than about 15 or 20 at any given time that are, technically and truly orphaned. So once it gets that orphan flag, then we start working. As we're doing that, we'll pull the operator's bond. So that'll give us some money to help pay for the orphan plugging process. We'll look for funding so that we can get the rest of the contractors that we'll pay to go out and plug the well. We have folks that come out and validate the work, and then once validate the plugging, then they'll go out and they'll clean up the land around it so that it restores it back to the habitat that's natural for the land, and ideally with the habitat that was there before the well was put in. And so ideally, in short order, we've got the land back to where it was before the well was drilled, and wildlife and recreation and all the folks that love and enjoy the lands are out to get out there and enjoy it. So
very cool. Well, speaking of enjoying the land, do you have a project site that's your favorite to talk about in terms of the orphan well program?
Yeah, well, one of the ones that we did a couple of years ago was a place called Pine Mountain. Honestly, it was the first one the first project I had been a part of here in Wyoming. And I was like thinking to myself, okay, here we go. We're going to go out there. It's going to be the classic, kind of flat lands, rigs going up and down. But it turns out that it was a privately owned surface. It was actually up on a hill pretty good size hill. Some might say a mountain. There was only one pass to get up to the top of it. So you kind of have to walk, go through a pretty rickety road, which was something we were thinking about on the way in. How are we going to get all the equipment up here? But when we get to the top, it was fantastic. Antelope, elk, raptors flying around. And then when we got up there, we had a really beautiful, clear, crisp day, and you could see pretty much what would seem like all of Wyoming. So it was one of those spectacular views. And there were about six or seven wells up there. And it was, going around just well by well and sorting out kind of what we needed to do with them. It seemed like, for the most part, pretty clear. But one of the cool things we found out is that the landowners could still use some of the road infrastructure. And so they were pretty interested in keeping that. The landowners were fantastic to work with. There were actually two. There was one well that actually sat over on a separate landowner. There was a power line that was up there, so we had to deal with the power company as well. And so, doing important things like making sure gates are closed and making sure that that we're being good stewards of the government, and being good partners with the landowners was really helpful. This project was actually pretty important because it allowed us to kind of work out the kinks in the system before the bipartisan infrastructure law came out. That bill legislation provided a lot of money to plug wells. We're still plugging wells currently in Wyoming on bill dollars. And so we were actually able to work a lot of the kinks out in terms of the contracting and landowner relations, making sure that we got all the interest holders in lease, got all that sorted out. And so, by the time the bill monies came down, we were really kind of rolling quite nicely. So it was a good project. We did find some things that we were a little shocking that we weren't expecting. There were a couple of gas lines that were kind of quasi on the surface, kind of somewhat buried, and we didn't see where they were permitted. These wells, mind you, were drilled back in the 50s. And had been abandoned for quite a while. The landowners were extremely patient. I think they were pretty excited when they heard we were going to come out there and finally be able to get those wells plugged. I think they did a great job appreciating where our perspective on, we'd rather not use taxpayer dollars to plug them, but recognizing that we could finally get the project together, they seemed to be pretty happy. The field office was very, very happy to get them done. They've been trying to figure out how to get them done for quite some time. And so it was a good project overall. When you take the infrastructure off the land, it's amazing what the land can look like. And when you took all the pump jacks off and the facilities off, it was very beautiful. I'm sure the wildlife was just having a lot better time out there getting around, not having to worry about dancing around a pump jack or whatnot.
Very cool. Yeah, it seems like with developing and strengthening relationships that you mentioned, between the field office and landowners and power companies, there's a lot of collaboration and a lot of momentum behind the program. It's encouraging.
I would be remiss if I didn't talk about our relationship with the state. From 2017 to about 2021, we had a great working relationship with them. It turned out that our fiscal years were different, and so that allowed us to kind of work more efficiently in terms of getting wells contracted and plugged. We contracted and plugged dozens, if not hundreds, of wells during that time. So, and we continue to work with them, just kind of making sure that we're not doubly planning to plug or reclaim a piece of land or well. And they've been great partners, and we definitely appreciate that.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today, Bill. I think we covered a lot. But there's always more to learn when it comes to the BLM's role in energy production and responsible land stewardship. On our website for this episode, we'll have information about the Orphan Well program as well as other helpful resources for interested listeners. I'm Azure Hall. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time on the ground.